Good evening. Better late than never. Let's get started here. We are holding in the middle of Tanya chapter 6. We haven't learned for a couple of weeks, so we are probably a bit rusty. So we'll have to do some nice chazara, some nice review here. We might actually be able to finish chapter 6 tonight, all depending how things go. Because the end of chapter 6 is relatively straightforward, and then it goes seamlessly straight into chapter 7, where we'll have some very interesting explorations about the nature of klipa and all these sorts of things that we're talking about. So chapter 6, as we've now said multiple times, the Tanya returns, the Holy Tanya goes back to talking about the animal soul, which we began talking about in chapter 1. And talking about the animal soul means that you have to talk about Klipa and Sitra Achra, because the animal soul, as we said in chapter 1, comes from Klipa. It comes from something called Klipa Sunega, inherently. But the animal soul comes from non-holiness. The godly soul is a soul that comes from the side of holiness, and the animal soul comes from the side that's not holiness. And we know that to the Alter Rebbe, there's only two sides, right? There's holiness and there's non-holiness. These are your two options. There's no neutral middle ground, although as we're going to now see at the end of chapter 6 and now going into chapter 7, where we delve more into the complexity of the matter, you do have something called klipas nega, which is like sort of the Alter Rebbe's neutral. But the truth is that even this neutral, even this middle ground is not really neutral, because anything that's not godly and not an expression of godliness is not Kedusha, is not holiness. And that's what the Alter Rebbe calls bad. It's not good, right? Goodness is holiness. And holiness means an expression of God. And an expression of God can only be outside of godliness himself, in our world, can only be certainly in a place of bittul, in a place of nothingness. Because you have to cross that gap from I am to God saying I am, which, as we keep saying, you can't do by having a more moral and a better behaved and a nicer and a more pleasing I am. It doesn't matter how refined and nice your I am is. You could have a very, very nice I am. You could have as it's discussed in the Maimarim, the animal soul doesn't have to be a rampaging elephant. It could be a little sheep. You could have a little sheep, nefesh habahamis. Never heard anyone. An animal soul is a sweet, gentle, refined animal soul. But the bottom line is that it's still bad in the sense of it's existentially separate from Hashem. It's not godliness. It's not an expression of Hashem, right? And this dichotomy, as I keep saying, and this is the deep review now, going all the way back to chapter 1, I keep saying, and it'll become pertinent to tonight's class again, that you can only appreciate this if you appreciate that everything begins in God. Everything does not begin in neutrality, right? This is one of the fundamental tricky differences between how the world tells us to think and how Chassidus tells us to think, right? The world tells us to think that things just exist. Existence is a given. Right? And then you have, okay, so God exists, the world exists, all sorts of other things can exist, but existence is a neutral given, right? It's so given that some people say in their religions, right, and their versions, or there are allegedly, or people have tried to make versions of Yiddishkeit where this is the case, whether any Jew actually ever really had a Yiddishkeit like this in their real life is questionable, but theoretically, at least, people have tried to say in Yiddishkeit as well that existence and God are the same thing, ultimately, right? Because that's the ultimate reality, is existence per se, that the thing exists. God is defined by being the ultimate Metzius, right? Metziusai Musai, and all of these things. Sort of, maybe, kind of, not necessarily pantheism, because you can have other existences, right, which get their existence from God, sort of as a secondary thing, right? All you're saying is that if you take away all the things that have been subtracted, right, if you remove all non-existence, right? What you would have left over is God himself. He is pure existence, so to speak, right? Everything else that exists is impure existence. Yeah, there's such a shita, very well developed with deep historical roots in Yiddishkeit and also elsewhere, of such an idea. But Chassidus is totally, for various reasons discussed elsewhere at great length. Chassidus goes in the way of Kabbalah, and Kabbalah, one of the main disagreements between Kabbalah and Jewish philosophy, or Kabbalah and other ways of looking at Yiddishkeit, is that Kabbalah rejects this out of hand. Kabbalah says that God is not existence, God is not a rational being, He's not anything that can be understood, right? At all, in any way, even theoretically. He's not a being of understanding. In other words, he's not part of how we understand things to be. This assumption that all things are have some kind of similarity, at least in that they all exist, Kabbalah says, who says? Not necessarily. Right? Yeah, lots of things, lots of different sources in Kabbalah there's many different ways you could see this in Kabbalah, but the bottom line is that Chassidus goes with the view, and the Alter Rebbe's whole program in becoming closer to God, which is the Tanya, is built on this foundation that first God, then existence. God precedes existence. Existence is itself a creation, whatever that means. Right. And necessarily that's going to be in a way that we don't understand, right? In other words, we don't understand what it means that existence is created. That can't be rationally understood. Right. But on the contrary, we say, okay, so it shouldn't hurt you that it can't be rationally understood. In other words, you think you can understand everything, that was the first mistake, right? In other words, if God comes and tells you that there's all these other things that exist, which is what God tells you in the Torah, in the Kabbalah, and in other places, right, beyond what exists and beyond understanding. So, if you're in it for God, if you're believing what God says, then you should be okay with that, even if you can't necessarily fully understand or appreciate what it means that existence is created. Fine. If existence is created, right, what does that tell you? Why is that important to our chapter? Because what that tells you is that this whole idea that we have of that the a priori assumption, the axiom, the hanacha, as we would say in Chassidus, right, the Hanachas ha'olam, we would say in Chassidus, which there's many fabrangans from the different Rebbeim about Hanachas ha'olam, the worldly assumptions, a weltische Upleg, you'd say in Yiddish, the axiomatic assumptions of the world that Chassidus is coming to rescue us from. Partially, that's part of what Chassidus is all about, right? The worldly axiom that there is this neutral ground fundamentally, and then all parties, like all people, I come to the table, which is the neutral ground of existence. So I participate in existence, and God participates in existence, which means that some things could theoretically just exist. They don't have to, they may have to do with God because God happens to be the existence that brings them about, right? But they don't have to do with God in their very teichen. There doesn't have to be anything godly about them per se. Right? There's nothing godly about them. They also happen to be existences, and to that extent, they because they depend on God, so there's some connection to God, right? But what does it mean to be? What is the verb to be? Liyot, right? What does it mean? To be means something other than to be godly.
Right? When we say God exists and we say we exist, it's completely non-synonymous.
No, it's completely exactly right. The sophisticated philosophers who say that God is existence would say that it's an analogous use of the term. In other words, it's a mashal, right? Our existence is a mashal, is a metaphor for God's existence. But Kabbalah comes and says it's not a mashal, it's two different terms, right? One may derive from the other. Your existence comes from God's existence, but it's not in a derech hayasha. There's gaps, basically. Right. There's inexplicable, non-rationally crossable gaps in that explanation. And a lot of Chassidus explains that process, right? That's part of the whole process of Seder Ishtalshelus and B'riyah Yesh Ma'ayin. And there's a whole story of Bekitzer, there's a whole teaching, there's a whole wisdom of how this comes about. But the bottom line is you can't, it's no like stepwise process to go from your existence to God's existence in a straight way that you could say both of them are existence. Not at all. right? In fact, we say you can't even do it with things that are much lower than God's existence itself, right? This is why Chassidus very much believes in what the Rambam says, that God is a Metzias Bilti Metzias Nimtza, that God is non-existing existence. You can't even say that God exists, right? Which we've spoken about in this class many times. And the truth is we don't have time to go into all of this, but we mean it in a way that the Rambam, at least mitzad his philosophy, couldn't mean it. We're more radical, even though the term comes from the Rambam, right? Which Hasidim would argue shows that the Rambam was not such a philosopher, because there's some very anti-philosophy undercurrents in the philosophy of the Rambam. Hasidim would say, I'm getting into
Jewish.
That's true. As always, whenever a Jew speaks, they disagree with themselves automatically, right? But the bottom line is that we're very radical about this. The Kabbalah takes this mamish kipshutai, and that God is beyond existence. We say no. We in the most literal, simple way possible. God is beyond existence. With the Rambam, or in philosophy, you would say it's much more complicated. It's yes and no, right? Anyway. It has to do, and it goes back to two fundamentally different ethics between Kabbalah and philosophy, and two fundamentally different worldviews. Okay. Why is that important when we talk about Klippa and Sitra Achra? Because when we're talking about things that it's either godly or it's in denial of God, and there's no neutral ground, this is why. Because existentially, in what it means to exist, there's only two options. There's everything else that's off on its own mission, and God makes it that way. In other words, it's not our fault, right? God makes everything to think that it has independent existence, and to think that existence is an a priori assumption. Everything we just spoke about is the way God made the world. God made such a thing called nature. He made such a thing called rationality, that we would think that existence is neutral. That all comes from God, right? But all of that totally misses the reality. The reality is that everything is godly. There is no simply to exist. There is no neutral, right? Everything is godly. There's only, do you know? Are you in agreement with what you are? Are you expressing what you truly are? Or are you somehow, and our chapter is really about how is this possible, or are you somehow in denial? You somehow alienated from what you are. But all existence is godly. The very idea that there should be such a thing as neutral existence, that something just can be without being godly, even if you explain that it ultimately comes from God or needs God to have been brought about, but I say, okay, it needed God to be brought about, but what is it now? And you say it exists without mentioning God, that itself is klippa. That itself comes from the Klippa and Sitra Achra. That comes from living in a world of Klippa and Sitra Achra. We'll discuss this more in chapter 8, God willing. In a world of Klippa and Sitra Achra, where basically we live inside of that illusion. Not entirely, Baruch Hashem, and I'm just talking about the animal soul, never mind the godly soul. We don't live entirely inside that illusion. It's possible to use rationality, as the Rebbe said many times in his sichas, to use rationality to discover the limits of rationality. In other words, you can break out from the inside, so to speak, sort of, more or less, right? But nevertheless, that's only partial. Our fundamental assumptions from living in a world of Klippa and Sitra Achra, right, make this a very difficult thing to grasp. Or to put this whole thing, the whole review so far, to put it in a single word, right, to put it in a very short summary, the natural position of the animal soul, of a thinking human being, a regular, biological, common human being, normal people, their fundamental assumption is Olamus b'pshitus, Elokus b'chadshus. The world are simply exists. When you come and say that God exists, it's an innovation. You work off the world. The world is assumed. God is innovated. Whereas the truth, das Elia, in the higher perspective, the perspective in Chassidus, the perspective that the Torah is trying to tell us, is Elokus b'pshitus, Olamus b'chadshus. God is the baseline assumption. The world is innovated. And if God is the baseline assumption, then it makes sense to say there's two fundamental categories. There's what expresses the truth, the godly truth, and then there's everything else. So in other words, the Alter Rebbe's way of saying good means godly and bad means everything else is based directly on this belief, this understanding, this worldview, right? That existence itself is a creation. Yes? Okay, so the Alter Rebbe begins chapter 6, and he says, everything that's Leila Hashem Heman, the famous words of the Alter Rebbe, all the things that are not directed towards God, right? He's talking specifically about the thought, speech, and action of the animal soul in that case, right? Everything that's not directed towards God is on the other side, is bad. It's a binary switch. You only have two choices. Is it godly or is it the other thing? And we call the other thing Sitra Achra, which means literally, of course, the other side in Aramaic. There's godliness, there's holiness, and then there's the other side. As we said earlier at the beginning of the class, holiness means the presence and indwelling and expression of God, which can only be in bittul. In other words, it can only be when you're not being the other thing, right? You have two options. You could be the other thing, or you could stop being the other thing. When you stop being the other thing, you revert to the default truth of the universe, which is that everything is an expression of God. Okay, here we go. Now, last time we learned, we said, we dealt with the question, a lot of the chapter 6 deals with the question, isn't everything from God? Right. In other words, or to put it differently, how do you get, if the real reality of everything is that it's an expression of God, so how do you get to the point where we are, where we live in a world that is totally, almost entirely not cognizant of this fact in its existence, right? Now you could say, now here you also see many other things. I try and do this as I remember them. It's difficult to remember them always when I'm preparing the class. But here you see, for example, why it can be both true that most people in the world believe in God, which statistically is true, right? And most people throughout history and most great thinkers throughout history even believe in God. And on the other hand, we say that it's a world of klippa and stracha and God is entirely concealed. You see immediately that in the Alter Rebbe's conception, there's no contradiction. In fact, they have almost nothing to do with one another, right? To be someone that says, I exist as a separate thing from God, I just exist, but as a separate existence, I believe in God, right? That's not Kedusha. That's not holiness, right? That's being a separate being that says you believe in God. So I am, and God is, right? That's not necessarily, I'm sure it's some level of bittul, but it's better than I am. It's better than absolutely. And we're going to see, there's levels in klippa, right? There's levels in being not batul, of course. But the bottom line is that that's not what we mean when we say kedusha. When we say kedusha, we mean you stop being a separate thing from God and you become an expression of God. Which the truth is we accomplish that. All of these things Jews accomplish, as Alter Rebbe is going to explain, or sort of has already explained, but we're going to see in retrospect how he explained it more clearly by contrast with Klippa. Jews accomplish this almost entirely by things that they have already, right? In other words, it's not about working on your midos and becoming more refined and having a more inner, deeper appreciation of some sort of spiritual thing, right, has almost nothing to do with Kedusha in Tanya. Right. In Tanya, Kedusha is traits of the godly soul. So in other words, something that's already holy. You've been given something already holy inside of you. It's the godly soul. You have to just get out of the way and let it come out, right? That's what a lot of the Tanya is about. You have Torah, which comes from God, and you have mitzvahs, which comes from God. So in other words, this whole idea, of course, there is a whole, as we've spoken about before, there is a whole personal development and spiritual development aspect of Chassidus, of course, but you just have to understand that a klippa becoming more refined does not equal Kedusha. Now, it may be more important to God than Kedusha. That's a different question, right? Because obviously God is very into the refinement of the animal soul, and in fact, that's when the Alter Rebbe was asked, the Alter Rebbe said that was the purpose of the entire Chassidus. It comes from Kedusha and it leads to Kedusha. Right. It's part of that whole conversation. I'm just pointing out that Most of what Chassidus says is holiness, right, is not of this world. In other words, it's not a klipa making efforts from its own direction, right? A person who's fundamentally, existentially, I am, existentially separate from God, who feels themselves to exist as a hanacha, as a fundamental axiom, which is the fundamental axiom of all worldly thought, by the way, as we're going to learn in chapter 8, right? It doesn't matter how open it is to the existence of God. Being open to the existence of God means you've lost already. Understand? That's a different way of putting it, right? You've already lost. You're already a klipa because you're starting with the assumption that you exist, and you're open to God more or less. You're more open to Him, less open to Him. You started with the assumption that you exist, right? That was the first mistake. That was the first. You've already entered the realm of klipa and sitra achra. So, in other words, the point in kedusha is to become a vessel for godliness. It's not to. Obviously, it's all more complicated than I'm saying, but it's not fundamentally, it's not about a klipa becoming more open to the idea of God. That has nothing to do with holiness. You understand?
Right.
It really, in fact, Chassidus, we would say it doesn't even have to do with God, because God is not an idea. And it's all connected. It's all the same. I'm sort of talking in a circle now. All these things are all connected.
But you can say, I exist as a manifestation of godliness. Can you say that?
If the I exist comes first, of course you can say it. Does it mean you're kedusha? Does it mean you are an expression of kedusha right now, and not an animal soul that's of klipa? I'm not sure. We really say
recognize what I exist means.
You would say. I think we would say, as I think we're going to learn a little bit later in Tanya. I think you would say that the thought might be kedusha. That doesn't make your nefesh bahamas kedusha. Understand?
Yes.
Okay. So the levushim is a different story, right? The levushim, the garments, which is where the main fight takes place and what life for normal people is mostly about, is the levushim, is thought, speech, and action, right? So in thought, speech, and action, as we're going to learn, God willing, at the end of this chapter, thought, speech, and action either can raise a person up to incredible holiness, or they can lower a person down even lower than their animal soul is, right? So in other words, as will become clear, thought, speech, and action are vitally important, but just because a thought is holy doesn't mean that the soul, the nefesh bahamas, becomes holy, as we'll see. As we'll see. Becomes holy fundamentally, you would say. In other words, whatever. We'll see. We'll talk more about that when it comes up. So what's the answer to the question of isn't everything an expression of God, right? So we explained it's the difference between receiving face-to-face from God, right? Versus receiving externally from behind, right? By the way, we were just discussing if someone that says, I exist, but I'm going to relate to God as He exists, would be called in Chassidus relating to God in a chitzonius way, relating to God superficially. Chitzonius in a way of chitzoniyut, from an outside, relating to God externally. If you think about it, it's literally an external relationship. I'm here where I am, God isn't, right? But I relate to Him, someone out there, right? It's literally the externalization of God, right? The way it's put elsewhere in Chassidus is God gives gives vitality like He would to an enemy over his shoulder, right? Relates to it externally. They have an external relationship with God, but this itself leads to the question: how is that possible? Right. What does that mean, right? So we explained in the previous class that it's possible because of the decrease in the divine light, basically through tzimtzumim, through contractions and limitations of the divine light. We spent a lot of time in the last class discussing the chain of the worlds, right? The way that the worlds chain down, pardon? emanate and chain downward, one world within another world within another world, like a series of mashalim, of metaphors, right? Where the previous level of the metaphor becomes the inner vitality and the soul, what the new metaphor is wrapped around, right? This core, which is its inner vitality. And we said that through many tzimtzumim and many metaphors, right, the things can forget, so to speak. This is our poetic way of saying it. They can forget that they're metaphors, right? The word that describes this is klipa, right, is a shell or a peel reality. And we discussed in the previous class at length why this is the mashal. Why is this the metaphor of a shell or a peel? We said it's like a banana peel, right? The banana peel doesn't exist.
Right.
There's just a banana. There is no banana peel. What makes a banana peel is you distinguish between the inner fruit. Someone comes and takes out the inner fruit to eat, and he leaves behind this thing that was surrounding that's dross, that's no longer needed, right? You create the banana peel by distinguishing and then removing the fruit from the inside, right? So in other words, the external layer, what was just the external layer of the banana, was not a peel at all, which was part of the fruit, right? Becomes, by removing the inside, which is, in the metaphor, is the process of tzimtzumim, right? Is you make the inner reality of the fruit very distant, right? So distant and so diminished, right? That the peel forgets that its role in life is to only be a peel. Right? It's like you've removed the fruit from the inside. It becomes, all of a sudden, you've created the peel of, you've created such a thing as a banana peel. Since the last time we had class, by the way, I thought of another nice metaphor for this, totally my own, not from any sefer or anything like that. But I thought another nice mashal for klipa, right, is a cliche, right, in language. Because what's a cliche? Cliche is a phrase that uses, which is true, right? It was made originally by someone creative to express what they were thinking, right? But somehow the words have gotten carried along, and now no one even thinks about what the words originally meant, right? It's like the words have become sort of a separate thing. The words have sort of taken on a life of their own. Taken on a life of their own is itself a cliche.
They use so much, it's become worn out.
It's worn out, and it's lost its real meaning. Right. You know that it's meant to refer vaguely to some sort of concept, and we talk about it like that, right? But the inner vitality has become lost. This is not whoever invented this turn of phrase, usually it was Shakespeare. Half the cliches in English come from Shakespeare. And whoever invented this turn of phrase, its turn of phrase is itself a cliche, right? Whoever invented this turn of phrase, it's all that original soul contribution. The fact that it was an expression of that person's soul has become totally lost. The words just get carried along by the language, right? Until they become totally dissociated from all original context. So what originally was a turn of phrase that was literally expressing Shakespeare's soul in a play or whatever, right, has now just become words. The words have a life of their own.
Sometimes some events happen and it gets back his life.
Sure. And that's our Avodah. That's why we're here.
Yes.
We're here in Olam Hazeh basically to return the cliches. We're here to destroy the cliche. Right. And how do you destroy the cliche? By making it no longer a cliche, which means you have to reunite it with its original chayos. You have to put it in the correct context, right? Or in the metaphor of the fruit, where you have to put the peel back on the banana, or put a banana back in the peel. Something. So that is basically where we're up to. Like I said, we have a fair possibility, even after this lengthy review, in the next half hour, we have a fair chance of being able to finish the chapter. So, without further ado, let's check this out here. We're on page, is this in the correct place? Yeah, we're on page 20 in the Hebrew. We're going to start with somewhere very near the bottom. we're going to start 3 lines up from the bottom last word.
V'lechein, right?
V'lechein, yeah, exactly. V'lechein, 3 lines up from the bottom last word. In the English, it's the last paragraph in the second column. Last paragraph on page 24 in English. In Hebrew, 3 lines up from the bottom of the page, last word on the line of page 20. Rearrange myself here. Okay. V'lechein, therefore, says the holy Tanya, the Tanya Kedisha, the Alter Rebbe's golden tongue. V'lechein nekra elam hazar malei elam haklipas v'sitra achra. Therefore, one thing I left out of the review, which was the last thing we read, by the way, is that this is called golus. This is what's called exile. You remember, right? So that when the holiness has come so far down, right, that it becomes totally covered over by this klippa, and all that remains is a being that at the deepest existential level perceives itself to be separate from holiness, right? We call this galus, the exile of the Shekhinah. What's the idea of exile? Is basically that the holiness is not sovereign here, right? The holiness is here, but it's not sovereign. You know the English word sovereign? Yeah, it's
surprised, but
it's here, but it has no dominion. It has no power, right? The klippa, the being, totally covers over. It's off doing its own thing, right? And the holiness within it, which is giving it vitality, is there, but it has no expression. It has no ability to express itself. It's there, but totally in exile. Okay. Therefore, this world and everything that fills it is called the world of Klippas and Sitra Achra, the world of shell realities, and the other side of shell realities and the other side from holiness, right? Here you see that if someone tells you that the world is good according to Chassidus, right? It's more complicated than it first appears. Depends what you mean by good. It depends in what context. You have to be careful, right? Because if you look explicitly here in Tanya, right, the Alter Rebbe says about this whole world, right? And again, I'll point out to you that the Alter Rebbe doesn't speak a lot about the world so far. It's all been about souls and what souls do. The worlds get very glancing mentions of some very side notes about worlds and worldly realities. And here, finally, we're talking about the world where we live, the physical world. Finally, we're talking about something I relate to. And what does the Alter Rebbe say about it? The whole world is called the world of Klippas and Sitra Achras. Why? Because Rubam Kekulam, the vast majority of everything that's in this world, right, believes and follows and behaves as if it has an existence per se, not a divine existence. Everything in the world is at least an I am, if not lower, right? Everything has its own existence. We perceive the world to be a place of existences, not a place expressing godliness and expressing the divine. In fact, the world, if you ask most people, I think they would say the world is not an expression at all, right? The world is what it is. It's a thing that is. It's not an expression of anything, right? This itself tells you that the whole world, more or less, with some exceptions, the exceptions being all the things that are holy in Elam Hazeh, which there are some, right? But the things that are not holy in this world are all Klippas and Sitra Achra. So, on the one hand, this means the world isn't good because the world doesn't have Kedusha, right? On the other hand, as I keep telling you, you have to remember how the Alter Rebbe is defining good and bad. Good means God is revealed there. So the world is bad. But when we say the world is bad, we don't mean, the average person wouldn't help a little old lady across the street. Maybe they would, right? That's not what we mean by bad. That's a different story, right? It's more subtle. That gets into more of a discussion of the 7 Noahide laws, the distinction between the 3 impure klippas and klippas noiga. We touched on this back in chapter 1, right? Whether it's a world of idolatry or a world not of idolatry. There's all sorts of other ideas in Chassidus which touch more on would the average person help a little old lady across the street. It's a different question. Right? Our issue here is, does the world express God? Is the world clearly a manifestation of the divine reality, right? In its very existence, when we say the chair is here, do we mean the chair expresses God, or do we mean something else, right? And in this world, everything in its very existence, from the chair to human beings to animals, everything is saying, I exist. Nothing, almost nothing is saying, I'm merely an expression of the divine, right? With, we would say in Judaism, some exceptions. A Sefer Torah is holiness in this world, right? Because a Sefer Torah fundamentally is an extension of God, personally, right? And the world recognizes that that's what a Sefer Torah is meant to be. But even the Sefer Torah is made up of physical matter, of course, which means that the Sefer Torah started, as we're going to discuss at the end of this chapter, and much more in the next chapter. The materials of the Torah start as klipa, right, and are made into kedusha. Okay, they start as animals and plants, basically, right? Yeah, tefillin, and are made into objects of holiness. And of course, as we know in Judaism, if one letter in the Torah is missing, it becomes not a Torah and not holy in a sense, right? It loses its status as the Torah. What does that tell you? It tells you that holiness is a very, very precise nature of being an expression of God. The Rebbe has a very interesting sikha where the Rebbe says that under a certain understanding, the Sefer Torah can't even really be said to be an object of this world when it's a Sefer Torah. Right. In a way, I've spoken about this before. The Torah looks at the Sefer Torah itself as almost an otherworldly object because of this. The world is a place of klipa and sitra achra. If you have something that is literally word for word the expression of God, expressed in exactly the way He wants it, it's arguable that it's not even something of this world. Right. It was before you wrote the last letter, but the moment you wrote the last letter, it's now not of this world. You could argue that Judaism, and I think the Rebbe makes a halachic argument, even if I recall correctly, that we look at it this way, right? Anyway, so the whole world, because of its majority klipa and sitra achra, right? The nature of this world is a nature of klipa and sitra achra, is a nature of not being an expression of God. As I'd mentioned in the previous class, and we'll discuss again in the next chapter, the higher worlds also have sitra achra, but there it works in a different way. Our world is the main klipa and sitra achra. If you want to ask, what's our world, the physical world, good at? It's good at being klipa and sitra achra. That's our forte. Even though klipa and sitra achra also exist in higher worlds, but with more awareness of the divine, which we'll discuss more, God willing, I believe, next chapter. Okay, continues the Alter Rebbe, last line of the page. Therefore, all the actions, how does he translate? All mundane affairs, he translates, are severe and evil. And wicked men prevail, as is written in the Eitz Chaim, in the holy works of the Kabbalah. So how would you describe this? The world is bad. Why is it bad? It's bad existentially, not morally. It's bad because it's not a manifestation of godliness. It's not holy, right? We're making an existential judgment. Now, deriving from that existential reality are some moral realities, right? That's why Elam Hazeh is such a rough place. That's why... and Chassidus would fully agree with this, by the way, you don't feel that the world is run by a just God all the time, necessarily, right? You don't feel that there's justice in the world. You don't feel the world is a kind place, a civilized place, right? The world can feel very much not like that, and that's because the world is made as a klipa and sitra achra. It's in denial of true justice. It's in denial of the true divine reality and all of the moral failures in the world. Right? All of the things that anyone watching the news would say that's absolutely terrible and inhuman and unjust, and all of these things, right? It derives from the existential state of being alienated from God. You understand? So there's two steps, at least. There's actually many more, of course. It's a lot more complicated, but it's at least two steps. In order to go against the will of God, in order to have an unjust world and behave unjustly, you have to think you exist in the first place. So there's two steps. There's the way God makes the world. There's a world of klip and sitra achra, where the world thinks that existence is neutral, right? And from there, that makes the room for the wicked to prosper, right? The world to be a difficult place, a harsh place, right? Where even mundane affairs are run with coldness and difficulty, etc., right? So that's the consequence of the world being full of klip and sitra achra, right? But the fundamental step is separation from kedusha, right? You can see here even just a little bit of the foreshadowing of the Alter Rebbe's ethics, of how he says people are to behave, right? Where Chassidus is very not focused on moral failure. Right? This is one of the famous things that distinguishes Chassidus from Musar, as the previous Rebbe describes in many of his sichos, right? Musar, you take a sin or a moral failure, a moral weakness, right? And it discusses how bad it is and what the consequence is and how it ruins everything, and the Gehenna and Gan Eden and then trying to convince you and show you things you can think about, right? To rectify your moral situation.
Just like Rabbi Silverman said that
Musar
is policeman of God and Chassidus is salesman of God.
Yes, exactly. How do you see that here? Because you can fix a lot of moral problems, maybe not all, but a lot, right? By introducing more Kedusha. If you become more God aware, right, that solves many, many problems. In Chassidus, it's called, as it comes from Tanya, the Lashon comes from Tanya, the concept comes from Tanya, that a little bit of light pushes away much darkness, which is the Chassidic approach, right? The Chassidic approach is to add light, and the reason why that works is because what you think is the real problem is not the real problem. You think the problem is that you're a bad person and a selfish person and who steps over other people, doesn't care for others, doesn't love enough, too much hatred, no patience, too much anger, all the different issues it talks about in Musar, right? And Chassidus would say that's not the real problem. That's the symptoms of the real problem. The real problem is that this is a world of klipa and sitra achra, and your animal soul is one of those klipas and sitra achras. What we need is kedusha. What we need is shining the light of Hashem. We need more holiness. We need to add more light, right? Which is the Hasidic approach. So when we hear, it's very early in Tanya here, obviously only chapter 6 of 53, but when we hear that the world is wicked and full of darkness and covers over the light of godliness, right? The Alter Rebbe would say that's not to say it's the fate of the world. That's not how it's going to stay, because who's going to fix it? You're going to fix it, right? That's the whole point. Yeah, exactly. You're higher. The whole point is not to say, oh, well, I guess the world is terrible and it's evil and it doesn't reflect the light of God. No. That's very Christian. You're here to fix the mess, right? You're here to transform the world. There's a beautiful, beautiful story of when Rav Gershom Mendel Gerelik, he was the Rebbe Shliach in Milan, a famous Shliach with many, many stories of blessed memory. So when the Rebbe sent him, there's many stories about him. When the Rebbe sent him to Milan, I don't know what decade it was in. It was probably quite a long time ago. I imagine he was one of the earlier shluchim. And Milan is like Las Vegas of Italy, to my understanding, right? It's a very grub, physical place, right? It's where the fashion industry is. It's very it's not like a high culture where refined people go. Milan is a very worldly place, to put it politely, right? So there was Rabbi Gerelik was walking down the street near the beginning of his shlichus in Milan, and a certain Jew saw him and was shocked, right? And he said, Rabbi, what's someone holy like you doing here? He says, Milan's a dirty town, right? Rabbi Gerelik says, it is a dirty town, and the Rebbe knows it's a dirty town, and I'm the Rebbe's broom. Right, that's why I'm here. Right. In other words, what do you mean? What do you mean it's a dirty town? I shouldn't be here. On the contrary, I'm the vacuum cleaner. I'm here to. This is my work. Right. So that you can see all of that very beautifully, just in the very in its. You can see the implications of that whole worldview just in these words of the Alter Rebbe here. Okay, let's do the Haggah. Let's do the Alter Rebbe's footnote. The purpose of this footnote is basically to explain that Well, the Alter Rebbe is about. We just said that the divine is in Golos, is in exile within the Klippa. We're about to say that in some of the Klippa, at least, there's no good in it at all, right? Which one is it? Is really what the Haggadah is here to answer, right? Is there goodness in exile within it, or is it no good at all, right? And the answer is, of course, as you know, yes.
What?
The answer is yes. Which one is it,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Of course. So the answer is going to be, this footnote is here to explain that godliness is present in everything, even though it's a world of Klippa and Sitra Achra, which is interesting just from that's the logical reason it's here, is the commentaries on Tanya say
if something has existence,
yeah.
I don't care how you call it.
Yeah.
God is there.
Yes, of course. That's of course true. But on the other hand, we've just said it's a world of Klippa and Sitra Achra that totally conceals God, right? So is it that there's no godliness there? Right? That's what we're clarifying, basically, what the notice here to clarify. It's interesting from the perspective of the student of Tanya to see this, because the second the Alter Rebbe says it's a world that's wicked and full of Klippa and Sitra Achra, we have to have a footnote immediately which says, but don't think that God isn't close, right? That's for the student of Tanya. I think that's the message of the footnote. The message of the footnote is, don't be discouraged. That's the message, basically, of the footnote. The message of the footnote is, yes, it's full of Klippa and Sitra Achra, and that's absolutely true. And we're about to say that there's no good in some of the Klippa at all, right? But you should know that whenever we say there's no good at all, it comes with an asterisk. That's not more powerful, that's not more true than the fact that God is absolutely everywhere. So don't get discouraged. God is very, very close. God is down here, absolutely, right here in this world. Is very close. He's not distant. He hasn't put all of these klippas and sitra achras between him and you. That's not the idea, right? Yeah, that's what the footnote is. That's the impact of the footnote. Let's read the Alter Rebbe's footnote. Haggah, says the Alter Rebbe, footnote, Im heyes b'seichei eser sviras da'asiyah de kedusha. Right, the world is a wicked place full of klippas, right, where the wicked prosper, and it's difficult and it's full of klippas, right? Says the Alter Rebbe, even though it has within it the 10 spheres of Asiya, of Kedusha. The 43rd portal, right? The world that we are describing as the wicked prospering in and being full of klippa and sitra achra, right, is Olam Hazeh Gashmi. Just to clarify here, right? We're talking about the physical universe where we live. Now, I've mentioned before, I think I mentioned it when we were learning chapter 1 of Tanya, in those fundamental classes, that in Chassidus, we don't believe there's such a thing really as just Gashmias. Even what we call Gashmi is also Ruchni, right? But that's a separate issue. Let's distinguish. There's our physical universe, right? It's called physical because everything here is in the same realm as the physical in some way. Even though in our physical universe, we also have spiritual things, right? 2 + 2 = 4, or the Pythagorean theorem is a spiritual thing in our physical universe, right? So to speak. So there's spiritual things here too. But we call it the physical universe because, first of all, physicality is unique to the physical universe. It's the only place in all the order of the world that has physical matter. Right? What physical matter is an interesting question, by the way. It's not such an easy question to answer. If you ever want to watch someone squirm, you could say, what is Gashmias? And have them explain it to you. It's not so simple, right? It's difficult to explain.
Do you watch What's the Bleep? The movie What's the Bleep?
No. It talks about what's Gashmias.
In a way. It's quantum physics,
Yeah, quantum physics. You say Gashmias is atoms or quarks or what emerges from the quantum foam and blah, 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 right? The bottom line is, but what is it? Right? What distinguishes it from something spiritual? If you can even find a scientist that believes the spiritual exists, it's a separate issue. But what is it that distinguishes it from the spiritual, right? It's kind of not such a simple question to answer.
Even I don't know the answer.
And that shows you. But your wagon driver might know, right?
Yeah.
So the world that's full of klippa and sitra achra is the physical universe, every world, as explained in the Kabbalah and Chassidus, has 10 spheres, right? The 10 spheres are that world's connection to the divine. There's different ways you could say this. It's the tools with which God uses to create. We sometimes say, although that's a very physical description of the spheres, a very coarse description. The bottom line is every world has a core, has a fundamental, the part of that world that knows the truth of God. Right? As we described last week, the worlds are a series of metaphors, one laid over the other, right? So the spheres are like the place of the person that's making the metaphor in that reality, right? It's the place of God. It's the achiza. It's the holding, the holding of God in that reality, right? It's how God is seen, is manifest in terms of that universe, in terms of that reality, right? So the 10 spheres are the spiritual core of each reality that they're in, right? And in fact, they determine the nature of that reality, as we said last week, right? The nature of the 10 spheres. The world of Atzilus is called a world because of its 10 spheres. Its 10 spheres determine what's real in that world versus in the world of Bria, where there's a totally different level of reality, right? So even though they're all in the same place, so to speak, right? They're all everywhere. Nevertheless, they're still separate one from another because what counts as real in a universe is determined by its spheres, right? So, I'm just explaining this first statement here in the footnote, right? The Alter Rebbe says that our world has the 10 holy spheres, the 10, in other words, the manifestation of God, right? Of the 10 of the world of Asiya enclosed within it. The world of Asiya, of course, being the lowest of the 4 categories of worlds, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, the world of action, as it's often called, right? The 10 spheres, so in other words, to translate into plain English, the manifestation of God in the lowest of the 4 categories of worlds, right, is present within the physical universe. In other words, what is the core of the existence of everything in the physical universe, right? It's 10 holy spheres. It's a manifestation of God, basically, right? Continues. So in other words, so even though we're calling it a world of Klippa and Sitra Achra, right? What is this world at its core? What is the core of its existence? If inside everything in this reality is a manifestation of God. Continues the Alter Rebbe, Ubeseich esosferes da Asiya elu hein esosferes the Yetzirah, Ubeseichan esosferes the Bria, Ubeseichan esosferes da Atzilu, Shebeseichan Ein Sof Baruch Hu. Right?
Babushka, that you don't see what the inside.
Yeah, very good. It's like a babushka doll, sort of. That's also very coarse, but yes. Or a series of mashalim, right? The inner vitality of each world spheres, right, is the spheres of the world that precedes it, as described at length in the works of Chassidus, right? The malchus of the previous world, the external aspect of the previous world, becomes the inner vitality of the next world, just like nested dolls, as you say. Right? The inner reality of in other words, the inner reality of the manifestation of God that's within our physical universe is the manifestation of God that's in the world of Yetzirah. And the manifestation in the world of Yetzirah, its inner reality is the manifestation of God in the world of Bria. And the inner reality of that manifestation of God is the manifestation of God in the world of Atzilus. And the world of Atzilus, as we know, what makes the world of Atzilus, the world of emanation, the highest of the 4 worlds, special is that it's totally united with the Ora Ein Sof. It's totally united with the infinite reality of God beyond all worlds, right? So in other words, what is the core spiritual reality of everything from a speck of dust, right, up to our entire universe in this physical realm? The inner reality of everything is the infinite reality of God. That's what everything is. That's the core existence of everything that is here in the physical universe. V'nimtza. Or in Seif Baruch Hu, if we find that the infinite light of God, blessed be He, Malei Chola Aretz Halazu Hatachtena, fills all of this all of this world, all of this lowest world, it's interesting that Malach Ha'aretz is quoting, right? It fills this earth, literally, fills this lowest world. Al Yadei Shusay B'Eser Spheres Arba Elim Asabiyah, through it being enclosed in the 10 spheres of the 4 worlds of Atzilus B'Ri Yitzir Nasiya. Mashakasu B'Etz Chaim Shem Zayin is written in Eitz Chaim, Perek Beis B'Sefer Gegulim Perek Chaf, as is written in the holy works of the Kabbalah.
So it's funny that the smallest babushka is actually the makif that surrounds everything.
Yeah, it's backwards, by the way. It's an inverted babushka. It is, yes. Right? We think of it wrong because the inside would be the smallest. That's the opposite, right? We're actually on the inside, sort of, if you want to think about it this way. Don't think of it in this physical way, but yes, you're right. So what are we saying? We're saying holiness is the inner reality of everything in the physical universe. There's nothing without the manifestation of the infinite reality of God within it. Now, which means that the infinite reality of God totally fills the world. That's what we mean, right? In other words, there is nothing here. If you go through this room and you say there's the air, the infinite reality of God. The chair, the infinite reality of God. The carpet, right, and so on and so on. There's no space in this physical world that's without the infinite reality of God. Now, here's a good opportunity to point something out, just good for the further study of Chassidus and for a deeper understanding of Chassidus, right? Here, we are not talking about the fact that God is everywhere because he is the Ein Sof. Right? There's 2 ways that God's everywhere. There's more than 2, but there's at least 2 ways that God is everywhere, right? The first way God is everywhere is in the way of the makif, the infinite presence of God himself, right? The infinite presence of God himself, what could be called Sovev Kolamin, God as he transcends all worlds, right, is everywhere inherently by definition. Right? Because he's infinite and he's God. So where would he not be? Right. He's everywhere by definition because he's truly infinite, right? All things are within him. He's in all places and all possible places and all impossible places because he's God, right? Infinite, transcendent reality of God. Right. But there's no hava mina, there's no assumption that klipa would mean he's not here because of that, because he's everywhere, right? The problem is, here's the little shaklavataria, the little back and forth here, right? It doesn't help anything in terms of the closeness of God to say that the infinite reality of God is everywhere, right? Okay, in other words, you win and you lose. You win by saying the infinite reality of God is everywhere, so nothing is devoid of God, right? How do you lose out? Because the way he's everywhere is only in terms of himself, right? Not in terms of the place where he is, right? So in other words, there's no reason to assume there would be any difference. Why would he not be in a place of klipa? Obviously he's there. There's nowhere that's not there. Because he's God, there's nowhere where he isn't, right? So in other words, you don't accomplish anything by saying he's here. Obviously he's here, right? It doesn't help the fact that I'm totally stuck within the klipas and sitra achra in the lowest world, totally cut off from any experience of that reality, right? It helps me nothing, right? In other words, obviously I'm being glib. I'm saying it in a joking way, right? But in a sense, it helps me nothing. It helps me nothing that this is all just within the infinite reality of God, somewhere up there, right? God is inherently everywhere. Okay, he's inherently everywhere, but he's not in this room the way the chair's in this room. Or maybe more apt to put it in a better way, he's not here the way the cheeseburger could be in this room. Right? The cheeseburger is much more real here in a way than God is, because it has the decency of being here in a defined, rational way where it's perceptible and finite and obeying and respecting everything else that's here. So I can actually perceive it and partake in it, right? Unlike the infinite reality of God, which is here because he's doing his own thing and his own thing is being everywhere. So, okay. Let's not get into that. That's just going to make everything more complicated.
But it's connected.
Yes, but to be fair, everything in Chassidus is connected.
Sure.
Yes, it is connected. So that is the way that God is everywhere on his own terms, right? Here we're saying something much, much more, right? We're saying much stronger. Here we're saying God is everywhere, not in a way of sevev, but in a way of mamale. right? The infinite light of God is within all realities in the universe, right? Meaning to say, God is within the cheeseburger. That's actually the point, right? That's why we're talking about Klipa and Sitra Achra, right? God is in this physical world, right? He's not here because he's everywhere, right? He's here specifically in terms of this world, right? The chair is a manifestation of the Ein Sof. The air is a manifestation of the Ein Sof in a different way than the chair, by the way, right? Everything is a manifestation, but in terms of what it is, right? In terms of the world, in worldly terms, everything is a manifestation of the Ein Sof. This is called Mamale, the immanence of Hashem, right? So now you say, okay, the footnote is coming to say that God is everywhere, meaning he's present in everything without remainder. The Ein Sof is expressed within every finite and limited and defined creation, right? So how can that be true? And it be true that the world is full of klippas and sitra achras which deny him? Aren't we saying, which one is it? Are we not saying that the klippas and sitra achra are also full of godliness, right?
The answer is yes.
But aren't we saying that the Klippa and Sitra Achra conceal godliness and make God totally not here? And in fact, we're about to say that the Shalosh Klippas HaTameis, there's no good in them at all, right? Like a cheeseburger. The three impure Klippas, there's no good in them whatsoever, we're going to say. How can that be true if God is in all of them? Right? So here we come to, this is a big sugya in Chassidus. This is something Chassidus talks about a lot, which is the idea that the concealment is only from the creation's perspective. That's the from below to above. In other words, the concealment that we see, where everything is not shouting out the fact that it's a manifestation of godliness, right, is a creation issue. It's not a God issue.
Again,
right?
it will change when Mashiach comes. Right?
So, well, yes, it will change when Mashiach comes, and we're supposed to change it now. Is the truth. But but just back up a second. But I thought that it doesn't help me that God is everywhere by dint of himself, and I can't see it. And now I'm saying I still can't see it. Right? I just can't see it, and I can't see a different thing. There's a different thing that I also can't see, right? Because now we're saying that no, God is everywhere in terms of the thing. The Ein Sof is within the chair and the air and the carpet, right? But you can't see it because it's a world of Tiv and Sitra Achra. It's very, very concealed there. What's the difference? It's not so difficult. It's simple. It's simple to explain. What's the difference? Why is this better? Why is this more encouraging? Right?
Why?
I still can't see it, right? I would say it's more even than it gives us purpose. I would say that it's encouraging because God is close. That's really the bottom line. Even though you can't sense it, right? Necessarily, right? And even though you have to do hard work to see this.
With both arguments.
No, in a different way. Because the way God is close in the first argument is he's close on his terms, not on my terms. This, he's close on my terms. I just can't see it. It's a difference, right? Okay. In other words, God is intimately involved and intimately present in all things in this reality, right? And being able to see it is just a matter of breaking through the klippas and sitra achra, right? In there's a beautiful mimer of the Rebbe Rashab, which you could live your whole life. If you only learn this mimer, you could live your whole life just on this mimer, where it discusses the second half of the mimer is all about Aveda, is all about serving God, right? There's a first half which is about an idea in Chassidus, and it's basically about this idea. V'yadaita Moscow, it's called. It's the mimer V'yadaita of the Rebbe Rashab that he delivered in Moscow. Very famous mimer, Tafresh Nun Zayin, from the Rebbe Rashab. And in this famous and celebrated mimer, which all Chabad Bachrim learning yeshiva, or should, I believe they do, almost all, the yeshivas teach this discourse, fundamental discourse. So the second half of the discourse is about Aveda. It's about, the first half is about how literally everything, even the lowest thing, is an expression of the infinitude of Hashem, which in that mimer is called Havaya V'Elokim Kul Echad. That's what that idea is expressed in, right? That even the lowest and most limited thing, right? God is present and is truly present within it, and from his perspective, he is literally right there. Right? It's just that from your perspective, you can't see it, right? And this is the same mimer where the thing about the Mishnah and the Gemara comes from that we discussed last time we learned, right? The Gemara compressed in the Mishnah and then put in the Mashalim, it's the same mimer, right? So in the second half of that mimer, the whole thing is about how we have to live and break through the concealments, right? It's about how do you see it the way that God sees it, right? And in that mimer, the whole argument is about withstanding nisyonos. That's what the whole second half of this mimer is about. Nisyonot. In English, nisyonos, withstanding tests, right? It talks a lot about Avram Avinu, right? And it says that Avram Avinu, when he's not burned in the Kivshan Ha'esh, right? It's not breaking the nature of the fire, right? So that he doesn't get burned.
The nature of God.
The nature of the fire is not to burn tzaddikim, because it's only an expression of God. Why would most fire by nature burn tzaddikim, right? It's because we live in a world where Klippa and Sitra Achra covers over the fact of all things. Why did it not burn Avram? Why did it not burn Avram? Right? It's literally, the Mimer literally tells you how to perform miracles. How do you want to? How do you in the Shoah? How do you perform? Absolutely, no doubt. Yeah. The Rebbe Rashab would agree with you. We're not saying how did Avram make the fire not burn? Right? So he lived his whole life. Avram had 10 tests. Right? Avram lived his whole life above his tests. Right? In other words, Avram had such emunah, right, and such faith and such devotion, right, that when he came to a challenge of this world, where according to nature it was impossible to overcome the challenge, or 10 challenges Avram has, right, 10 tests, right, and that's in Chassidus, Nisayan is defined. There's all my marim about what do we mean by Nisayan. It's very good, and it's a whole thing about how there's Klippa and Sitra Achra, and then there's a Nisayan, and the Nisayan is like the lowest level because it's literally a direct denial of the reality of Hashem, right? And when Avram withstood the Nisayan, and he withstood not just withstood, but with Simcha and with Emunah, right? All of a sudden it was revealed that there was no Nisayan at all, because that's what happens when you break through the Nisayan.
Daniel in the land.
Absolutely. When you break through the Klippa and Sitra Achra, right, what is revealed? Immediately it's revealed. The whole thing was Kechut HaSaira, as it says in the Talmud, right? The Klippa and Sitra Achra, the fact that anything was in your way was all like nothing. There's nothing really there, right? The Kedusha is much stronger and much more real. Like we said, a little bit of light pushes away much darkness, right? It's just that the light is very concealed. The world is very dark. What's our job? Our job is to break through and illuminate it. And this footnote of the Alter Rebbe is saying, God is right here. God is very close. And through your Aveda, through aiming to break through the Klippa and Sitra Achra, you don't have to bring God into this world, like the whole thing from far away, right? Godliness is everywhere. Godliness is present, right? This whole Klippa and Sitra Achra thing is a temporary thing, number one. And number two, it's a superficial thing, right? And when it's your job to break through and find God, you don't have to go very far. Yeah, it's encouraging. You're not encouraged. Don't worry, if you prefer being discouraged, there's elsewhere in Tanya that will discourage you. It's good.
Still Alma the Shikra and Alma the this.
Absolutely. Let's finish the chapter. Yeah, it won't take us very long. From the top line on page Yud Aleph in the Hebrew. However, Klippa is divided into 2 levels. The rest of this chapter talks about the lower level of Klippa, and the next chapter is about the higher level. Yeah? Zulamata Mizu. There's 2 general divisions in Klippa, one lower than the other. The lowest level, is called the 3 impure Klippas, Hatameus V'Raz L'Gamre, which are impure and totally evil. Here's where the Alter Rebbe says they have no good in them at all. And they're called in the chariot of Ezekiel, the vision of Yechezkel. In Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 4, Ruach Sarav Anan Gadol Ve'esh Mitlakachat is what the V'gemer is for, right? There's a blowing wind and a big cloud and a revolving,
billowing
fire,
yes,
right? So these are the three impure klippas in the vision of Yechezkel, right? Now in Chassidus, the 3 impure klippas are never fully differentiated one from each other, I don't believe, right? In other words, they're just 3, but there's no. They come as a package. No, there's you can make distinctions, but the fact is they always come as a group. You never, like in Chassidus, as far as I know, you never see like today we're dealing with one of the 3 klippas of Timaeus, right? These are a package deal.
The point is that no nitzot can be salvaged from there,
as we'll see. Yeah. Although the truth is that nothing's so simple. But yes. By the way, the Rebbe points out that bepashtus, I think the Rebbe says that it seems to the Rebbe, right, that these three things are the Ruach Sara is wind, Anan Gadol is water, and the Eish is fire. So you have three impure Yesodos, and Afar in Kabbalah is often included within the other three. So in other words, you have the three impure, all the impure elements, right, that are the three impure klippas. And from then, no, it doesn't in the first chapter either. From then, you have a Gilulim? Interesting, yeah, different prince of Tanya. From then, you have influenced and has drawn forth the souls of the nations of the world. Your version reads idol worshippers, right? And we know from context that the Alter Rebbe means idol worshippers, because we know that the Chassidim U'Mesa'elam do not come from the Shosh Klippos HaTameis. We discussed this all in our chapter at the end of chapter 1. So anyone who's watching the stream, who's coming to our classes for the first time, should go and review what we said in chapter 1. About the idolaters and the different categories of non-Jews and non-Jewish souls, etc., etc. We talked about all of that there. The bottom line is, as we're saying here, we're repeating what we already said in chapter 1, that the souls of the idolaters, the idol worshippers, right, come from the three impure klipos. It is there. And it's interesting, he says, the kiyum gufam, and the sustenance of their body, which means that the soul and the body have two different sources of sustenance in Chassidus, mentioned many times in Chassidus, right? In other words, when the person passes away, the body doesn't pop out of existence, right? The body remains, which means that the body has its own separate source of existence aside from the soul, right? A much more temporary without the soul. It doesn't last for very long, right? But it has its own source of existence. So both of these, both soul and body, right, in the idolater derive from the three impure klippos, and we've already pointed out in chapter 1 a very interesting thing, which is that unlike how it works for Jews, there's basically different rules for how Jews and Gentiles work in terms of klippa and sitra achra. Unlike for Jews, the non-Jewish idolater, simply by changing behavior and belief, can switch the source of their own soul, can transform from coming from the Shosh Klippos HaTameis to the higher level of Klippos, to Klippos Noiga. Yeah. So, continues the Alter Rebbe, V'nafshes kol balei chayim atmeim, so too the souls of all impure animals, right? What's an impure animal? A bear, a dog.
Not, what's his name?
No, all of them. V'asurim v'atmeim v'asurim ba'achila, that are impure and forbidden to eat. It's interesting that he says that the commentaries on Tanya point out they're impure and forbidden to eat, right? Why does he say that? Because an animal can be forbidden to eat and not be from Shosh Klippos HaTameis, right? Exactly. If you have a kosher ox that's not shechted in the right way, so there's ways where the animal could be from Klippos Nega, and yet eating it is still forbidden, right? And we're going to discuss in the next chapter. The Rebbe has beautiful letters where he gets into like all the nitty gritty of like the interaction of our behavior versus the inherent nature of the thing, and he explains it all in Alter Rebbe's view, right? How you can take something that's one level of klippa and turn it into kedusha, or you could bring it down into Shosh Klippos HaTameis. Sometimes your action makes something worse that was already bad. You make it even worse. Sometimes you make it better. It's all, as we're going to discuss, all in the next chapter, right? How behavior interacts with inherent nature, because we're saying fundamentally that the nature, there's two different levels of concealment of God, right? The things that are forbidden by Torah, the Torah tells you the things that are forbidden because they come from, generally speaking, the Shosh Klippos HaTameis. They come from the three impure klippos, which means those things that have no room to be reattached to godliness is basically what it means, right? At least not in the normal way, not through any normal means. Do they have any way of being reattached to God? These are banana peels that you can't put the banana back in any normal way, right? So these are the things which are therefore forbidden according to the Torah. So you have idolaters, you have impure animals that are forbidden to eat, v'kiyum gufam, not just their souls but their bodies as well. V'kiyum v'chayas kol ma'achlos asuros, all forbidden foods, me'atzameach, from plants, orla v'kilaya kerem chulu, like for example, orla and kilaya kerem, which means the fruit in Israel before it's
3 years,
right, during the first 3 years, and then you have kilaya kerem, which is the forbidden mixtures, right, forbidden grafts and mixtures of plants, all of which are forbidden to eat, right? The commentaries point out that some foods, like chametz, for example, are not inherently shalosh klipas tzmeis, obviously. They become forbidden to eat and own on Pesach, right? But they obviously, being kosher chametz, right, come from klipas nega initially, all of which we'll talk more about in the next chapter, God willing. They come from a higher level of klipa because they're kosher foods, they're not forbidden. The kain kiyum v'chayus. Note how we said 3 impure klippas in human beings, in animals, and in plants. Why not in domem? There is no such thing as domem that is inherently shalosh klippas tzmeis. Interesting, no? So the Alter Rebbe doesn't say it. There's no such thing as inanimate matter that is inherently of the 3 impure klippas. All inanimate, neither did I until I prepared this class. All inanimate matter is inherently of the 3 of the klippas nega, of the higher level of klippa than the permitted, in the category of the permitted rather than the forbidden, right? Whereas in the other categories you have people that are inherently of the other.
But even if you take
categories,
a stone, throw it to somebody and kill him, the stone did nothing.
You're using klipos nega for a forbidden activity, forbidden purpose. Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're saying. As opposed to, in the other categories, there's things that are forbidden to deal with them in any way. That's what we're saying, right? And that's another question. What about something that you're allowed to own, but you're forbidden only to eat? What's the nature of that, right? We're going to discuss this all in the next chapter. All the details, very interesting, right? And confusing about all of these details. We'll discuss that, God willing, in chapter 7. And so too, the sustenance and the vitality of all thought, speech, and action of all 365 forbidden, thou shalt nots, forbidden things in the Torah, the Anfeyan and all of their subcategories and sub-commandments, Sham, Seif Perek is written there at the end of chapter 5 in the Shar Mem Beis of the Eitz Chaim. So, the 42nd chapter of the Eitz Chaim, 42nd portal of the Eitz Chaim. So what we have here, we have 3 impure klippas. We're going to discuss more the nature of klippa. It's really like a cliffhanger ending of this chapter because we didn't even, what does it mean that they're 3 totally impure? It's all going to be discussed next chapter, right? Versus klippas nega, the other klippa. The important thing to take away here, right, I think, the lesson at the end of the chapter is that when the Torah forbids things, it's because of their inherent nature, according to the Kabbalah. And this is a very difficult thing. This is a very difficult thing. Why is it difficult? Because the Torah's bans are not rational. Yeah. In other words, the Torah bans you wearing shatnez, right? For example, right? And in Chassidus, of course, we explained that even the mishpatim, the things that are rational, we don't do on a rational basis. We do them because God commands them. And in fact, as the Rambam explains, if you go into the details of the commandment, you'll see that there's no commandment where all of the details are rationally explicable. Right, in all of the anfeyan and all of the branches of the commandment, right? The Torah is basically commanded by God. We derive what to do not based on rationality, but based on the application of specific rules to texts, which the texts in turn are the word of God. Right, that's how in Judaism we decide what to do. It's not there's philosophy involved, but if you read the Gemara, good luck finding the philosophy. Right, it takes great geniuses to dig under and find the philosophy that's hiding in the Gemara, which again only affects how you read the verses. It doesn't, and how you interpret in very specific cases and all of these things. Fundamentally, the Torah is the commandments of God, and yet, if the Torah bans it, we're saying it fundamentally has a different spiritual nature, right? It has a different neshama. If you have 2 apples sitting in front of you, and one is erla and one is not, right? They could be identical in every perceptible way. We're saying they have 2 different souls, right? They have 2 different neshamas. They have 2 different inherent natures in terms of their relation to the divine. This can be very challenging to appreciate, right? Except, unless you remember what we said at the beginning of the class, which is why I think it's beautiful. It ties off the whole chapter in a beautiful way, which is that the rational in Chassidus is created by In other words, you're saying it's totally arbitrary. It's totally based on whatever God wills. It has no grounding in rational perception, right? I would tell you the whole concept of klippa also doesn't have a grounding in rational perception. You understand? In other words, this whole thing where we say it's either holiness or not holiness, right? As we said at the beginning of the class in our review, that itself is also based on the idea that all of this is the arbitrary creation of God, right? Rationality doesn't bound God. In fact, this is what you would expect according to the Alter Rebbe's understanding of God and existence. According to the Alter Rebbe's understanding of God and existence and the rules that it follows and the rational way that things are and the perceptible nature where we could tell the difference between the two apples in some perceptible way, all of that is a creation of God. All of that is already operating within the realm of the Klippa and Sitra Achra, right? What has to be higher than that realm and determining the nature of that realm is God's will, which is God's Torah, right? In other words, the idea, a person who's trying to find rational explanation eventually would have to ground that in God. So why are you so surprised that the Torah is the only place that tells us the difference between the two apples? The Torah, which is only the will of God, right? That's the fundamental reality that this whole concept of klippa has been pointing us back to in the first place. In other words, if you're accepting the concept that something is bad because it's not an expression of God, right, then you'll have no problem with the fact that the 365 negative commandments of the Torah determine what is klippa, because it means the same thing.
Don't look for logic, look for Torah.
Generally speaking, I think that's good advice, yes. Now, the truth is that once we've accepted something on a Torah basis, we're meant to understand it. That has to do with dealing with another klippa, which is called the klippa of seichel, the klippa of intellect, which is a different klippa for a different day, God willing. Okay, we'll continue next time.